Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Nancy Perloff, Curator of Modern and Contemporary Collections here at the Getty Research Institute. I'm going to introduce our panel now, and let me introduce our panelists, and I hope everybody picked up biographies for each of them. Stephen Bann, we're very fortunate to have all three panelists here tonight, together maybe for the first time. Stephen Bann, from the University of Bristol, Marjorie Perloff from Stanford University, and Sergio Bessa from the Bronx Museum of Art. I want to give a brief introduction, and then we will have a conversation. I want to start with the panelists keeping in mind the question of the visual, what the role is of the visual in concrete poetry, and how this plays out. When poetry is no longer a column of words on a white page, but rather a visual and spatial construct, what are the effects of this transformation on the reader? That would be my opening question. Before I dive in and we hear answers to this, let me provide you with a few definitions of concrete poetry. What does concrete poetry mean? I want to start with a definition by Eugen Gomringer, who in many ways was one of the founders of concrete poetry, and certainly someone whom Ian Hamilton Finlay knew of, and of course Augusto de Campos as well. So Gomringer spoke about constellations, and that was part of an important manifesto that he wrote called From Line to Constellation. This is 1954. And he defines constellation as, quote, the simplest possible kind of configuration in poetry which has for its basic unit the word. It encloses a group of words as if it were drawing stars together to form a cluster. It is a reality, the constellation, is a reality in itself and not a poem about something or other. End of that quote. Now, let's hear what Ian Hamilton Finlay had to say about concrete poems. This is from March 1963, and he writes in a letter, I've been writing concrete poems, poesia concreta, but I think I'll call mine thing poems, one word, thing poems. I want them to be simple objects, very important to pay attention to that word, gay or sad, and no more complex, very appropriately, than potatoes. Of course, being me, and this is important, there's a vernacular local element. So I'll manage to estrange all audiences by not sticking to one category. I've also, and this is largely what has saved me, been making toys of wood and various objects, such as boats, airplanes, a stove with a tall chimney and a moon on top, a lollipop pot, a tower of umbrellas, and he goes on to describe the toys. I want to do it, that is, make poems, so they are just things. Simple and good, and subtle in a subtle way, i.e., simple on top, but full of hidden life. Things, objects, and he's comparing it to making wooden toys. Now, just a couple more quotes before we start our discussion. This is going to sound very different to you. This is a quote from the pilot plan for concrete poetry by the three Brazilian poets, Augusto, Geraldo, and Decio Pinhatari. So this dates from 58, and the language is quite different. Concrete poem is an object in and by itself. Its material, word, that is sound, visual form, semantical charge. Then it sounds quite scientific. Concrete poem, by using the phonetical system and analogical syntax, creates a specific linguistical area, and this is very important, verbi-voco-visual, which shares the advantages of nonverbal communication without giving up words' virtualities. Tensions of things, words in space-time. And finally, a short quote by the poet Emmett Williams, talking about the visual element in poetry, concrete poetry, tended to be structural. It was a poetry, quote, far beyond paraphrase, a poetry that often asked to be completed or activated by the reader. Those of you who were in the exhibition may have already observed that. A poetry of direct presentation, the word, not words, the word, using the semantic, visual, and phonetic elements of language as raw materials in a way seldom used by poets of the past. And with that, I'm going to move over and join the panelists. We're going to talk for probably a little less than an hour, and then we'll open it up for question and discussion. But now we maybe go back either to a response to those definitions or a response to this issue of the visual. What happens when we move away from the column of words on the white page? And what effect does that transformation have on the reader, on the viewer? Does anybody want to start? Go ahead.
Shall I answer next?
Stephen? Sure.
I mean, one thing that occurs to me is that the definitions you gave, two of them came from what you might call manifestos. Gomringer, rather on his own, because he hasn't met the Brazilians then, the Brazilian pilot plan definition comes after they've made, as it were, common cause with Gomringer, so it's a program in which he is involved. The Finlay, rather different. He comes later, doesn't he? And
Yes.
I find that Finlay defines concrete poetry in a different way according to the constituency he's writing to a fellow poet, maybe to somebody who's about to be his wife, to a collaborator who he thinks doesn't know much about poetry. And I think his most memorable letter is to a fellow poet, Pear, where he writes in 1963, just the same time as the one you gave.
Yeah.
And he ends up by saying the concrete poet is a model of order if set in a space filled with doubt. And I think that's a wonderful way of putting it, what space means to him.
Yes, good.
Well, there's another element. I'll also begin with a letter from Finley. This is to Ernst Jandl in 1965, and I think this is so apropos today, where he says, I can't agree that just any poem defines itself as art. On the contrary, almost any Scottish poem of the present is offered to one as a comment on life, an aid, an extension, etc. Hence we get inane critical remarks like, X has something to say, which actually means X's poems are crammed with jargon about politics, hunger, Scotland, his love life, or whatever. The notion that something to say is actually a modulation of the material scarcely enters anyone's head. And I can't stress that enough. You know, a lot of people are very confused what concrete poetry should be called, perhaps abstract poetry. It seems, almost the opposite in a way, but it's so apropos today. We're in a period again now, like the 1930s, where everything is judged. If you read reviews of poetry at all, such as they are, it will be, what did that poem say? What is it about? Always the about, and that's ridiculous. I mean, if you have the about, you really don't need poetry. The other ways of doing it, it doesn't mean there's no meaning, but the meaning has to be contained formally and expressed formally, and that was Ian Hamilton Finlay's idea, and I think all the others, I mean, whatever, the one thing they all have in common is that notion that a poem isn't designed to say something. Get out there and say something, some didactic statement. And if you want that, there are many easier means to get it, but is designed to be something and to be something that you contemplate, and that the meaning is complicated. It's much more complicated, and you have to reread it.
And if I just then, let's hear, but the wonderful, very short quote that relates directly to that is a comment that Finlay made in a letter actually to Emmett Williams, where he said, the didactic, the saying about is over.
And I think one thing that we should also take in consideration is that concrete poetry comes in the post-war, and it's kind of a continuation of that moment that Mallarmé detected in the 19th century about the death of the verse. So the verse, the Parnassian kind of poetry was not producing anything interesting anymore. So one quote from Mallarmé that for them is very important is that idea that Mallarmé wrote in Un coup de deux, that he was trying to capture the prismatic subdivisions of the idea. So this idea that thought is not conveyed in lines, but it's more sort of prismatic. And in your quotes, you mentioned two ideas that I think it's very central to this discussion. One is the idea of the constellation, which comes from Mallarmé, and then also this idea that Finlay talks about things. So it's the objectification of the word. But it's the thing not as a sort of an inert object, but it's the thing almost like in the Heideggerian sense of this thing of a thing that it's also a being. So there is this kind of dialectic thing in it.
And so then, if we think about the question, first of all, the visual, and how important is the visual in concrete poetry and why, but also how does the transformation of language, the visual transformation of language, how do we read that? Now, we have many objects we can refer to, including the one up on the screen right now, which is a very good example of reading both from left to right and top to bottom, so that you have paper, pair, paper, pair, paper, pair, paper, pair, paper, pair, but if you look vertically, pair, paper, pair, and to the right, paper, pair, paper. So it starts to invite readings that aren't linear and discursive, right? Maybe somebody wants to comment on that?
Well, I think that it's interesting that this is from a set of pairs, as he says it, dedicated to Eugen Gomringer.
Right, so
because
good
Eugen
example.
Gomringer had produced a poem in his Constellations which goes ping, pong, ping, ping, etc., in that particular form. Now, Finlay is always trying to transform pre-existing sources, sometimes in a critical way, and otherwise in a purely aesthetic way. Why does he take pairs? Because he sees the pair in the work of Noigandres and the Cubists as a kind of epitome of form. That is, as it were, that comes through not only in this set of poems, but also in the wonderful poem which he has called O Pear Girl, which is a luscious pear, and the text, as it were, is O Pear Girl, repeated throughout. It's a poem I know well because I had to cut out a pear for him once in order to have it printed. But the other thing, I think, is that he is not only instancing the poets he knows and instancing an aesthetic code, but also I think you could say he's very often and increasingly concerned with what you could call metaphor. Now, we heard a delightful reading of the Star poem, but what, of course, we couldn't get from the reading, which was sequential, the image of the poppy. And at a certain point in his career, he says we must bring back metaphor, but the metaphor comes through the use of an overall image, which in a way defies linear treatment, even though you can, as it were, unpack it in a linear way.
Do you want to comment? Does anybody else want to comment on the use
I
of pair and
think
paper?
the idea, in your question about how to read this, I think it's essential. I think what's happening is, again, I'm going to bring up this idea of the post-war, which is a new moment, it's a new chapter in civilization. And there are two things that I think it's very important, actually three technical innovations that I think it's sort of behind this whole thing of concrete poetry, which is the typewriter, that it's accessible to everyone, the tape recorder, that you can record voices, and any kid, anyone can do it, and also the portable camera. So those things, they create new modes of writing, new modes of representation. And in a sense, when I write about the Brazilian concrete poets, I'm always struck that they're always trying to read this new reality that it's kind of emerging, particularly in a country like Brazil, that it's kind of trying to break from colonialism and embracing modernism and all these new gadgets and inventions. It's, of course, it has a huge sort of repercussion. And I think that this new kind of possibilities of reading. It's not just reading the poems, but it's actually reading sort of a new reality at large, you know?
Yeah.
When you've been to São Paulo, Marjorie, you too, and maybe Steven also too, and you'll see when you're in a city like São Paulo, it's like a concrete poem, you know, like the signage and the crazy buildings and the, you know. So I think this confusion of the poem that we see as a confusion, it's kind of translating that kind of environment that they were living in a sense.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
I think it has to be understood as a kind of, to get back to the idea of the post-war, which I think is one of the big things we should talk about today, a second stage modernism, because of course often people say, well, Marinetti used letters,
Sure.
and in the Parole in Libertà he had the letters all over, and and the Russian, of course, avant-garde did it. It's in Nancy's book, Exploded, he shows beautifully. And so what's really so new? What was so new? What was so different? But it is actually very different. And whether we call it, as some people started to, the arrière-garde or the avant-garde, what happens is it's a recovery of what happened before World War I, really. I mean, the really early stages, you know, there are people who have said by 1918 it was all over. I mean, that's when you had the really great innovations. But after World War II, what happens is that those innovations are brought back but carried to a much greater extreme. And because of the typewriter, the tape recorder, I don't think it could be more important than that. That you have this new technology, and you're therefore going to have a new way of working. And often people are very hostile, especially in the United States. We'll come back to that whole question. Why did concrete poetry never really carry on in this, do that well in the United States? But there's a kind of hostility of saying, oh, it's just like advertising. That's all it is. Oh, it's just like greeting cards. We all do this. Anybody can do it. Well, it's very hard to do it well. And many of you know that if you go on any of the websites today, like the Nikos Vasilakis website, Vizpo, V-I-Z-P-O. Every other person does it, sure, in some way, but it doesn't really add up to very much. And it's not really very interesting because it's very hard to do well. But it's a way of thinking of poetry as really rather different, especially not so much from Joyce and Pound, which are its sources in many ways, and Mallarmé, but from the 1930s, where you got a very didactic, long poems, straightforward syntax, that you can read it pretty much just the way you read prose. The one thing about concrete poetry is you can't read it the way you would read a short story or prose. And that's very important, because that's the big difference between it and other poetry. I mean, other poetry develops a lot of things about the word too. And I would say, by the way, it's not only the word, it's the letter, the phoneme, the smallest thing. And the reason that the letter is so interesting today for us especially, Kenneth Goldsmith talks about this, I know Nancy wanted to come back to this idea later, is that we're so used to the computer, and from the computer now, of having to get tap the right thing. If you don't tap the right thing, your password won't come up. If you get one number wrong, it's all over, right? You can't do it. So you're aware of every letter. And letters become more and more interesting. And if you take the word lonely and the word lovely, the only difference between an N and a V is an upside down N, or vice versa. And yet it has an entirely different meaning. So letters become very important. And you also know the letters become important. I'll just give this one example. When I dictate a lot now on my iPhone when I'm in a hurry and I don't want to write it out loud, I just dictate. And you've all had the experience. It can't do proper names. It gets used to some proper names from your voice, but I recently went to a wonderful Faulkner exhibit in Virginia, a Faulkner exhibit. And so I was writing to a friend and I said, I saw a wonderful and excellent Faulkner show. And it came out, I said, Molly has on an excellent Faulkner show, and it came out in Fuck You. Try it. And I tried it twice and that happened.
Can we actually,
In Fuck You. That's how it came out.
Speaking of that,
That's a great, this is where we got to.
This is what we've gotten to. And I just wrote a message before, and the same kind of thing happened. It was a name, whose name did I have? Anyway, and it'll come out not just wrong, but it often comes out a dirty word. I don't know why that is. But they're the words that are used most often.
Yeah. Could I say
But-
something?
yeah, I did just want to, if we could see Leisha fingers or what, I think the whole idea of speed. And for instance, Gomringer, after describing Constellation, talks about how this new poetry, the Constellation, will keep pace with the rapid methods of communication in the contemporary world. So there is a relationship, as Sergio was also suggesting, to advertising and to aphorism. But the reason I suggest bringing this up just for a moment, this is 1953, and the care and the labor that went into creating this poem has to be recognized. You're not just zipping off words that turn into fuck you. Here, you've got individual sheets of carbon, red, yellow, blue, whichever, and the poet, Augusto de Campos, is actually putting the individual carbon sheets into the typewriter and getting the color he wants. And as you can see, the letters shift even within a word, 3 red, and then it shifts to yellow. So you can imagine the painstaking work here, but it is part of this kind of new typography of the post-war and what one could do. So go ahead.
But it's certainly not a typewriter.
No.
This is letterpress.
This is letterpress,
and I
that's
think
right.
it's quite important
That's right.
when you mention typewriter,
Yes.
because there are
Yes.
poets who use the typewriter exclusively,
Right.
like Sylvester Huedar. But one of the really
Huedar, yeah.
crucial aspects of the 60s is letter set.
Yeah.
The ability to, as it were, to create your own typography and your own spacings. Because
But Stephen, this was done in 53.
of course, I'm talking about
So
the 60s.
it's before letter set.
No,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But in the 60s, I actually edited a magazine in 1960. You had to send it to be typeset. It was hot metal.
Yeah.
No other way. 66, I was editing another magazine, and then it was photolitho. And it's a totally different, it gives you complete freedom. And it means effectively that there's a kind of, a sort of technical imperative to look at the letter in different ways. And typewriter, you can even get typewriter type to set letter at that particular stage. And you do that, say, for our Edwin Morgan's poems, which depend on absolutely even spacing of the letters.
But it did, I think what you meant by the invention of the typewriter as compared to handwriting.
Yeah.
And not letter set, but as compared to, after all, earlier
Exactly,
poets.
yeah.
Yeats still wrote, for that matter, Faulkner, I noticed in this exhibit in the 1930s, wrote all his novels by hand.
Yeah.
They have beautiful handwriting and beautiful, but they're first written by hand, then you give it to the typist types it up, and so when the typewriter becomes the norm, and by the way, if you go see the Carl Andre show, which is downtown now, that isn't quite concrete poetry, but he himself felt it was related to it. Those are done with the Selectric typewriter, which only has certain settings in certain spaces, and they have to fit exactly that and depend on that. So I do think the typewriter, even though you're absolutely right, of course, about letters.
There is that famous quote by Truman Capote when he saw the manuscript of one of the beat writers, Jack Kerouac, and he said, "This is not writing, this is typewriting." And I think that is it's very humorous, but it's also kind of indicates a new, yes, it was not writing, it was typewriting, So kind of interesting.
Yeah, one point, and then we can move on, but just to be sure people understand, this whole idea of the recovery of the avant-garde in the post-war. A comment by Henri Chopin, there's also a credible statement by Augusto de Campos, but Henri Chopin writing about how in 1949, Dada was completely unknown and completely eclipsed by Surrealism. Quote, "It was all very vague. Nobody knew what Dada was, and nobody knew very much about Italian Futurism or Russian Futurism. It was only in the 50s that I learned about the Dada period from Michel Suffolk." So I don't know if you have any comment on that, but it's part of this discussion of recovery. But we can move on to what I think is one of the very interesting and provocative issues in concrete poetry. Concrete poetry, known as an international movement, an international post-war movement. How did that take place? Did that mean, so for example, Ian Hamilton Finlay has his magazine, Poor Old Tired Horse. And in Poor Old Tired Horse, he publishes work by a great range of poets, He publishes Russian poetry at one point, Hungarian, I think even Japanese. So there's this great range of poetry. There is this interest in an international movement. But at the same time, each of these countries, and if we look at Brazil, we look at Scotland, we look at Austria, Ernst Jandl. So my question to the panel is, how did this internationalism work? And to what extent are we still talking about individuals who have their very particular national or nationalist approach to poetry and language?
Understand?
No.
So, who wants to?
Stephen, why don't you
And then Mother, you can.
Yes, I think there's really a lot going on there. I think if you look at the visual arts generally, after the Second World War, it takes a long time for international connections to be set up. And what is remarkable about the period of the 60s up till the invasion of Czechoslovakia and so on is that Europe is effectively operating by the late 50s, as a kind of free unit without strong divisions. Then, of course, it goes backwards for a long time. People are sending work to exhibitions across frontiers, and of course, American art is becoming known in Europe, in Germany and in Britain, bit by bit, even in France. So that I think the phenomenon that Henri Chopin describes, what you said before, it's very true. Things had disappeared during the war period from sight, as it were. You know, they were still potentially there. There were still people that when I was editing magazines in the 60s, Raoul Hausmann was still living in Limoges. I mean, the great poet from the Hans Richter was still alive. And when Marshal Dusson died, we got Hans Richter to write an obituary for him, so that it was possible to reconnect, literally, with people who were there. But in order for that to be possible, the lines had to be open. And for the period in which the concrete poetry is rebooted from the 55 onwards, that is the case, I think.
Well, yeah, but
do you
it's,
both
you know, I had said this, I said this in my book on original genius. I would now question it a little bit. It's very much the fruit of a minor culture in many ways. I mean, by minor culture,
Concrete poetry
Switzerland,
is, yeah.
Switzerland, Brazil, not Rome, not London, not New York. And after all, abstract expressionism is at the same time, and is very much an American movement, you know, not international, really. It may have later become internationalized, but it certainly didn't begin that way. And what happens is you have the minor cultures, and I'm cynical about that a little bit, but I don't mean in a bad way. First of all, it's a way to get yourself read. Let's get realistic. I mean, I hardly know any Portuguese. Nancy doesn't know much Portuguese. Of course, Sergio is Brazilian. But concrete poetry, you can work with it with a dictionary if you know a little bit, which I can't do with a novel by Clarice Lispector, right? And it was a way of attracting attention of countries, true of Gommeringer, I think, too, writing in Switzerland, in German, but in Switzerland, of getting yourself known abroad. And that's not so easy, of having an international movement. Today, it's very different because everything is immediately translated. But there's a big price to pay for that. So this was a period where it wasn't yet thought that you just read everything in translation, what the hell, you know, and never mind what language it's written in. It does matter what language it's written in, but it can be read in other countries, and the poets work closely together. They all got to know each other and write to each other, and it's fascinating how you have Scotland, again, a kind of a minor culture in that sense compared to the London world that wasn't interested. And the hostility to it, I want to repeat that because I think it's important, was very great. Elizabeth Bishop, who's reviewed in the New York Review of Books just today, another huge article about Elizabeth Bishop. Elizabeth Bishop wrote to Robert Lowell from Sao Paulo, or maybe it was Rio, I can't remember which, and said, you should see the awful work they're doing here. They're making little squiggles and doing little things with letters. It's kind of cute, you know, and nice. And can you imagine that they think that's poetry? That's what she wrote. That's how that was regarded. And that was about as late as the 60s, the mid-60s.
But if we move to, for a moment, to Augusto, and Sergio, this is really for you. And again, those of you who've seen the exhibition have observed this perhaps. Why was it so important to Augusto to include glossaries? And even say for Poemobiles, which are those wonderful pop-ups that you see in the exhibition, he has actually a glossary in French, in Spanish. Krista, help me, third language. English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. Yeah, thank you. So why? I mean, why was that important?
I don't have that version of the mobiles, but I don't think the Poeta Manus there was a glossary. I think the glossary in the
yes,
original.
there is. There is
Really?
a glossary. Yes, yes.
Okay. My copy only has the preface and then the poem.
And then the other example, we don't need to use that one,
sheets that
Coli do Escapo, that one, also comes with a glossary.
Wouldn't he just be because he wants people to be able to read it?
Well, it's
People
part
in
of the
other countries.
question of internationalism.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly there was a concern or a need to communicate beyond one's own country, and Finlay did it in a different way. But I just do find, particularly with Augusto, these glossaries very intriguing.
It's kind of it's a difficult question to tackle because I don't think there was so much about this. Going international, because when the Mary Ellen Salt's anthology comes about, the movement actually is at the end in Brazil. Haroldo is coming to an end.
Yes.
Because they started in the very early 50s, and Décio was totally not interested in concrete poetry in the 60s anymore. He was actually doing advertising.
Décio Pignatari, the third.
He had his own advertising company.
And he wrote novels.
He wrote novels. Haroldo was interested in Baroque. So they were kind of going into other things. So when it became sort of an international phenomenon, in Brazil was already kind of a done deal. It was, and Augusto is the only one that actually kind of kept that sort of experimental edge. And you could say that he's still a concrete poet, but he also changed quite a lot to sort of other formats. His work became less about the letter set and the typewriter, and became more about almost like poster-like and design.
Well, even
video and so
Pulsar,
forth.
O Pulsar,
Exactly.
has a complete, the last poem of the Brazilian that we heard.
Yeah.
And I should have said, by the way, that was read/sung by Caetano Veloso, the great Brazilian songwriter, singer. So that's a very special thing.
But one thing that I can offer in terms of this idea of an international thread is the fact that Max Bill won the São Paulo Biennial in 1952, I believe. And he was considered a concrete artist. And he influenced many of the visual artists in Brazil.
Right.
And then he went back to Switzerland, of course, and within a few years, he was the head of the school in Ulm, in the south of Germany. A lot of the Brazilians went there, including Décio Pignatari. So there was that connection. That's when Décio meets Gominger, who was secretary of Max Bell. So I think the international thread is Max Bell. And also, I actually went to Ulm a couple of years ago to do research there. And I didn't realize that Max Bell actually was educated at the Bauhaus. And he was invited to Ulm because they saw him as kind of this heir of the Bauhaus and kind of giving a total Bauhaus face to the project.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, Gomringer was half Peruvian. And if you look at the constellations... Bolivian, sorry, I thought it's Peruvian, but no. Bolivian, South American anyhow. But if you look at in the Constellations book, there are several poems, Avenidas e Flores. There are poems which are in English, fog, or as well as German.
Wind,
And I think and the meeting that took place at Ulm was the meeting which, as it were, sealed the bond between the Décio and the Brazilians and the Germans, Swiss, and Gomringer has the very table at which they were sitting in his museum in Germany now.
So speaking of technology, as Sergio brought up, I want to move just briefly, because there's some other important questions, to sound and the treatment of sound. And one thing that is very interesting to me, for example, is that if you take works by Augusto, like these kind of emblematic one-word or two-word poems, lujo, lijo, so luxury, garbage, viva, via, hooray, hissing, rêver, to dream or to see again. They have a sonic quality to them if you hear, but we were talking about this, unless you look at them, unless you actually see the words unfold, they don't really have the meaning. So the question that's interesting is, how do we talk about sound in works like that? Is sound very important? Is it a verbi voco visual example? How would you address that?
It's very important, but you know, in that essay that I wrote about Poeta
Yeah.
I addressed this issue of the wish to sound, but the impossibility to sound. And in Augusto, you find a lot of that. And I think a lot of the poems, actually, I have to say that I am not very excited about their own readings. I think someone like, you know, you just showed the poem read by Caetano Veloso. So when you have like someone who comes from music and kind of gives a new reading of the poem, and it's very, very exciting. But the way that they read, it's still, you know, for me, it's still very conventional and doesn't explore all the possibilities of
And
that.
how does that mean, though, just so people understand that you try to make the sound, but you can't quite make it, like with Augusto? Did you want to
Well, in his case, it's very complicated because Augusto is so interested, and this is the interesting thing about concrete poetry in Brazil, which is not a very, they never consider themselves like an avant-garde divorced from popular culture. So he's fascinated with popular culture, with samba. So this poem, The Poeta Menos, which is so sophisticated, has a lot of references to very popular music. And he loved a very particular singer from the south of Brazil who could emote and in this very kind of subtle way. And I think it was this wish of kind of giving voice to the emotions that, you know, for him was probably, and he tries, you know, he's been doing like this live performances with his son, who's a musician, and he's very interested in music and sound, but it's something that, you know, comes very hard.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I think there's great variation. I think Finley, and I felt that hearing as wonderfully as you read them, I don't think those are, I mean, sound is nearly as important. I think those are visual, very strongly visual semantic. And I think there's a range. Jandl is not all that visual. I mean, he does visual things, but he's primarily a poet. So there's an enormous range. Augusto, as it happens, city, cidade, that one, and the ones that become videos, they're more sound, they're really sound pieces in big names. So it depends. There's a big range. There isn't one thing called concrete poetry. We should get that very straight. I mean, there isn't, you can't say this is it and they all do that. Ping pong, you mentioned Gomringer's ping pong, or wind. I mean, there's nothing to be say about the sounding of wind, really. I mean,
There it
you know,
is.
wind, okay, now I've said it, wind, but I mean, it needs to be seen, and so does ping pong. Silencio also, with the emptiness in the middle. Do you have a silencio? No, you know, those are meant to be seen. So I think there's a big range. Haroldo de Campos, who there isn't so much in the show because it isn't really strictly concrete poetry, then wrote concrete prose, what he called concrete prose. His big work, The Galactias, goes to the end of the line and is really in a kind of chanting prose form, but he still called it concrete because it was basically the same philosophy as far as language goes, but it's very different again. So I don't think there's one, but it is important to mention sound, I think, because again, the usual cliche was, oh, concrete poetry, that's visual poetry, so sound, I remember somebody said this at a conference, Joanna Drecker said it at an MLA, this is meant to be seen, not heard, sound has nothing to do at all.
I would-
And that, of course, is exaggerated too.
But
Go
I think
ahead,
there's really, I mean, there's a confusion here, isn't there? Because, for example, in Rappel, Finlay has a wonderful poem which
Yes.
is basically the word oboe, ow. And you can't read that without, as it were, interiorizing
That's
the
right.
idea of an oboe producing a note. So sound is really important, I mean,
Yes, I agree.
in the process of
I
reading.
agree.
But I do know also that, I mean, Ian Finlay certainly thought that Jandl was the only person who, when performing his poems, really, as it were, got the essence of the poems, because they have
Interesting.
both a formal and a phonic structure.
I also think that hearing them aloud, even the Finley, and there were people laughing, the patch of potatoes. I think there's something about hearing that one aloud that brings out humor. And I don't know how much has really been written about humor in concrete poetry, but there's a great deal. Even the vita, vita, vita. I mean, if you really kind of relax and listen to that and watch that, there is something absurd about that poem. And so I do think humor is important, and I think it could be discussed. But let me move to a couple of other questions. One, if we look at Finlay and Augusto particularly. Finlay being the poet who lived outside of Edinburgh at his garden and was very much a rural person, and Augusto living in São Paulo being very much an urban person. Maybe the multilingual drive of Augusto had something to do with being urban, but what impact do you think, any of you, that very different background had on their work?
Well, I'll just say a few things about that. It's very interesting that Augusto, now he lives in this big apartment because, you know, he was a lawyer, he became a judge, and he did very well. But he still lives in the same neighborhood where he grew up, which is something so typical of Brazil, and particularly from his sort of working class, you know, and you create roots and you stay there. And Haroldo just lived a few blocks from him.
Yeah, and when you think how big São Paulo is.
Exactly, and you know, until Haroldo's death, and he was in bed for the last 3 years, I believe, but the two would call each other all the time and they would collaborate. So there was that sense of neighborhood, of being a very kind of tight kind of thing. So this is one thing. The other thing also is that, yeah, absolutely, they love São Paulo. São Paulo is the ugliest city that you can imagine, but there is a kind of a beauty in that, and they are so proud of that. And particularly Haroldo did a poem towards the end of his life that it was kind of a recreation of the Odyssey. And it's basically this one day of São Paulo character kind of going through the city. So they constantly kind of make reference to that, you know, to the city, to their, I think they're very proud of being cosmopolitan and, you know, living in a big
So the
city.
role of nature. I mean, how important is nature in Augusto's case versus Finlay? I mean,
The
you know,
opposites almost.
opposite. Well, that's what's so interesting.
I was thinking that there's not a leaf
Yeah.
when we were looking
No.
at the Finleys yesterday at the
Exactly.
seminar. I don't think in Augusto there's a leaf or a tree. The
There
very
is in
idea,
Haroldo, but
wow.
it's a different thing, but yes.
Yeah,
It's
but
very
you have
urban.
to take
That's
into
a very
account,
good
though, when I first met Finlay in 1964, where he'd already written Rappel, he was living in 2 rooms in an Edinburgh terrace, but he was dreaming of the Orkneys. In other words, all the early concrete poems were written in the city. He would look out and see, you know, grey stone. But as I say, I mean, he was always wanting to get to the country, and when he got to the country that really things started to get better for him in the sense of being able to do more ambitious work, and indeed, of course, to create a garden.
And dream of the ocean, right?
Yes, exactly.
Well, he was always dreaming of the ocean.
Yeah, I think
Water.
it's to me, it's a very interesting contrast. I think.
Well,
you
but
do.
the similarity is, again, what they're all against. When you mentioned surrealism before, the one thing that Augusto and Haroldo hated,
Yeah.
come back to Finley in a minute, was surrealism. And the joke was, we live in a surrealist country. We really don't need surrealism. We have enough surrealism. And their hatred of surrealism was beyond all bounds. But that was because by that time, French surrealism had morphed into a sort of, endless kind of
Generic
series
kind
of
The fantastic
bizarre
and the-
images. And they really hated that. And that was the fight, was to bring it back to kind of Joycey and Poundy and Mallarmé purity, get away from that. And so... and I think that I don't know whatever Finley, did he ever talk about surrealism? I don't think he liked surrealism
not really, but
either.
the thing he really hated was what he called neo-Dada. And he talked about
that's similar,
trying to civilize neo-Dada because it was in need of civilization in his view.
I see him as an enemy of surrealism too, though.
Well, he would have been,
Finlay.
yeah,
He would have
absolutely, yes.
hated it, and the idea of the subconscious and finding all these, images and ha-ha, and these are really all sexual allusions. Not that there isn't sexual language, but not done like that, not. And
Well,
so that was the bête noire, was surrealism, and I think that goes across concrete poetry really all the way. For
they're
all of them
very
in different
interested
countries. Hatred of
in
surrealism.
utility in Brazil. So they're very taken with the modernist program of things being useful. So, by the way, Richard Neutra was a huge idol for them because Neutra came up with these beautiful houses. They're very, healthy oriented and so forth, and they're fascinated with that. But I was going to give you an example of how the relationship with the city kind of is translated in the poems. And maybe you don't know this, but the poem Luxo is actually about real estate
There it is.
in New York. Yes.
It's about
So
real...
it's about, so this poem was 1965, which is about 1 year after the military coup.
Right.
And one thing that Augusto realized was that all of a sudden, in the newspapers, there is advertising for luxury towers in São Paulo. And these luxury towers, they're ugly because they're not modernist. They are kind of paying homage to colonial architecture and Baroque architecture, and they are horrible, horrible hybrid. And the token of that whole thing is the word luxo, luxury, is written just like this full Baroque, full grandiose. So this poem is actually a collage because he cut the word luxo from the newspaper,
yes.
and he multiplied, and he created lixo.
Yeah.
So lixo, trash, made of luxury. So I wrote about this poem for an essay for a catalog in Spain. And for me, in a sense, this is it's a vision of the city. The city, a city made of buildings that it's just a failure in terms of architecture.
Well, so
this kind of negotiation was happening all the time, and it's very codified.
Yes.
And if you don't know the stories, it's a little bit hard to read.
So I want to mention one thing that relates directly to that, but from the Finlay side, which is that the poem that you all heard read, which is Sea Poppy 2, fishing boat names. You may have noticed that in parentheses. So, in fact, as Stephen explained to me, all of those, Nord Star, Universal Star, Faithful, these are all actually names of fishing boats. So the interesting question, just as with Luxo Lijo, does it matter that one knows that or not? Can one, extrapolate? So that to me is just kind of interesting that Finlay is really using code names that he's giving you the hint, it says fishing boat names, but how do you really know that that's true?
Well, also, Sea Poppy 1 simply has their registration numbers
So there
and their
it's more
places.
obvious.
So in a way, they're a doublet in that case.
So here's a kind of broader question, and this may draw some responses from the audience because we're going to take it to questions soon. The whole issue of the political, concrete poetry. Concrete poetry is a political expression. I've read many views on this. I'll just quote from Kenneth Goldsmith, because this struck me as very interesting. And then I would love to have the panelists address a little bit how, to what extent and how concrete poetry expresses a kind of political edge or politics of its time. So Kenneth Goldsmith writes that the Noigandres group, the group of Brazilians, quote, set out to change literature by creating a universal picture language, a poetry that could be read by all, kind of. Letters would double as carriers of semantic content and as powerful visual elements in their own right. Delightful to the eye and political in its intent, their agenda was nothing short of revolutionary, to create a visual Esperanto that would ultimately dissolve linguistic and thereby political barriers between nations. It's quite a strong statement. What are your thoughts on
Well,
that?
I just agree with the Esperanto. I don't think
Yeah.
concrete poetry is Esperanto,
yeah.
and I don't think it can be read by everyone. I think context is very important, as we heard yesterday in terms of the work of Finlay. Same thing for the Brazilians or the French or in Germany. But I think I agree with what he says. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Political?
Well, political in the sense of, revolutionary in that way, but I mean political, more strictly speaking. I think it's interesting about Lujo Lijo because Viva Vaya is the same way. People think Viva Vaya is just Viva, hooray, Vaya, boo, football cheer kind of thing. But in fact, that was written when I think Caetano Veloso was performing and people were screaming at him, and it was already after the time of the junta, after 64. And he had his enemies, and then he also had his supporters who were teenagers, and Viva Vaya was the center of that particular fight. So there many of them are in fact based on political things, but just very condensed. But another thing that fits in here, and to go back to your question, Nancy, about do we need to know that they're ships? Do we need to know that in fact those are ships? It's not just a matter of verbal, visual, which also things, but etymology is very important. And that's true with the ships, comes up all the time too. These are all, and that's something that people tend to forget when they think it's just puns or let's say metaphor. Etymology, there's the famous one, which I actually don't think is in the show. Is it the seas waves, the waves sheaves,
yes, it
the
is.
seas naves? We
Yeah,
don't have
we
it.
have
Do
it.
Do we have it? The seas waves, the waves sheaves.
There were various versions.
The seas naves. And the seas naves, the word nave as in a church, comes from the Latin navis, ship. Yeah. So it isn't just that he's playing, with similar sounds and that it's naves like the naves in a church, because naves take you back to ships. So that's what I mean about choosing words so that they're very meaningful. That's something that the Russian poets, for instance, did a lot of. That etymology, the word's etymology is very important. And that's where I think the ships come in. And it's very true for one of the things that Augusto loved about the idea of the city. Of course, he loved the city anyway, but that he found those three words that whether it was cidade, cite, or city, they all have the same root, and so you can do atrocity, velocity, complicity, university, and he has at least 45 words that have that same root. And then he says them very quickly, city, and you think, my God, how could there be that many words with that root? So it makes you terribly aware both of the sound and the morpheme, really, of that word. And that's why, things are very condensed in that sense. But I do think etymology plays in. Now, how political is that? The charge against it was, and Nancy and I have discussed this, is there's a woman named Carolyn Bayard who wrote a book on Canadian post-concrete. And this book was written, I think, in the 80s. It was sort of very 80s, sort of very critical of concrete poetry, and saying that concrete poetry is too pretty. That was always the criticism. It's too pretty, it's just lovely, but it isn't really profound, and it isn't political enough. And she chose poets like B.P. Nichol and Steve McCaffrey, who actually aren't as good concrete poets in many ways, I think, at all, as the previous generation, but are very political. And she made all this fuss about that it was just pretty. And that's also been a criticism of art people. We'll come back to that. Liz Coates in her book, what is that book called? Words, anybody know?
Words to be looked at.
Words to be looked at. And it's about fluxus, and it's about various movements. And she says, I think I may even have copied it out, that some people might relate this to concrete poetry, but no, no, no. Concrete poetry was just decorative. It was attractive, but it didn't really have the meaning, and so that isn't at all what Fluxus is doing. Now, the irony is that Carl Andre, who certainly wasn't a concrete poet, but was friendly with some of them, said that's not at all true, and we do have a strong relationship to it. So that's a point that has been very much argued. But Joseph Kossuth also really attacked concrete poetry by saying, concrete poetry, we know how to use language, they only know how to use words, and it's just pretty, and it's decorative. And Augusto and Geraldo are often criticized, aren't they, in Brazil, for being apolitical and being just attractive.
That's why. No, so that's actually a perfect segue to
Could I
one
say something
more
about
question.
Finlay
of
and
course.
politics? 'Cause
Yeah,
we
yeah,
haven't
yeah,
said it,
absolutely.
Because I think there is a real, a fascinating paradox there. Because in one sense, I mean, his great enemy, I mean, he didn't really choose. It was a Scottish poet called Hugh MacDiarmid,
right.
who actually had been best man at his first wedding, but they fell out, and Hugh MacDiarmid, at a later stage, wrote a pamphlet called The Ugly Bird Without Wings, in which he attacked Finlay. Now, MacDiarmid stood for a kind of programmatic Marxism and a sort of nativism going back to Scotland and to an invented literary language. But anyhow, it was a complete opposite for Finlay. Now, you might say that Finlay's work is difficult to see in a political sense, but the fact remains that he is the person who, in terms of, you might call, the politics of culture, I mean, he actually had a sheriff's officer coming to confiscate his works because he refused to pay rates on a building which he decided was a garden temple. In other words, he was political in the cultural sense to the highest degree.
Absolutely,
Right,
and very
absolutely.
important, I think.
So, as a final question, and this is really leading in an interesting direction. So, we talk about concrete poetry, it being viewed as pretty, it being viewed as decorative, possibly by some critics, and the Hugh McDermott Marxist kind of slant as well that Stephen brought up. So, I think maybe some of you are even thinking about this. How would one say concrete poetry, especially as represented in the decades of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, differ from the text-based work of Jenny Holzer, Barbara Kruger, Lawrence Weiner, John Baldessari? And before we take an answer, I do need to quote Finlay here because he addressed this. He wrote in 94, he wrote in a letter, "In my own little way, I am always aware of literature. And it seems to me that artists like Jenny Holzer, for example, would be much better if they were more aware of the literary tradition of the short sentence, text, or whatever. They are clearly ignorant of the aphorism and its related forms." It's quite a quote. So how do we take up the text-based work in relation to concrete poetry?
Well, I have to say straight away that I went to University of Southern California and saw the Jenny Holzer garden.
Oh, there's a Jenny Holzer
There's a
garden.
Jenny Holzer garden,
Wow.
and it's a rip-off from Finlay. It really is, but she doesn't know how to carve letters. She has it all machine done.
Oh.
And it's politically, let's say, it wears its heart in its sleeve. She quotes a whole number of things from what's said at the period of McCarthyism. But the point that Finlay is making is that Finlay is well aware of the tradition of the inscription, which has to be pithy, which often has a classical or other elusive character. And it's not the same as putting slogans on a granite bench.
Does anybody want to defend Weiner or Holzer or any of the others?
Of all those names that you mentioned, I think I have a lot of respect for Lawrence Weiner. And I sort of learning more about his process, you really understand he does an amazing work. I'm not so keen on Holzer or even Barbara Kruger. I think Barbara Kruger has a little bit of a ripoff of the Russian avant-garde too, but I don't know if that is very interesting. And I think it affects the whole thing if you do like this big political work, and then you see at the Broad Museum. So
Yeah.
it's, so what's the politics of that? But I don't know, I really don't know if that is, has any depth to concrete poetry. I want to say that no. No. Yeah.
It's parallel, but what's interesting is, like, when Liz Coates says, a reliance on rather quaint illustrational or pictorial modes as in the poetry. But she's thinking of Apollinaire's calligramme, which is hardly concrete poetry, it's something very different. But Charles Bernstein once said, looking at a Jenny Holzer, they need better librettists. Yes. And I think that, to me, says it all. I mean, they did, it was such a novelty in conceptual art that you had these artists who put language in. John Baldessari, our local great star, the language is put in, and that seemed so novel that you have language, but I've always found a lot of that fairly boring. It all depends, I guess, what world you come out of. Even Lawrence Wiener, you'd have to explain to me why
Yeah, you have to explain that to me,
it's so
too.
remarkable, because the language isn't very interesting. And so it's more the idea that you use language than what it says. But it is true that with some of it, you did after a while think, get a better librettist. I mean, you can't really do both well. And that leads to the example, how many people can do 2 arts or 3 arts well? Right. And there are not too many people that can. And one thing I would say for the concrete poets in this show, in the show right here, is there are people who really do, like Finlay, have both a verbal and a visual and a sonic sense in a way too. And that's very rare, because most artists have one or the other. You don't really get very much of both, and we didn't used to expect it. You don't expect a Monet or whatever also to have, verbal, whatever, verbal, or I mean, it didn't really happen. The poets would do their thing and so on, so that it is in a way asking for a lot. But it is funny today that these very people who sort of put down concrete poetry as being, quaint or illustrative or something like that. I have a question. Could I ask the panel a question, or all of you maybe?
Yeah, and maybe,
There was a big article about a humament, Tom Phillips' a humament, that's in the TLS this week. Now, a humament, and I've taught a bunch, a humament was a thing that Tom Phillips did where he took a human document. He found a novel on a bookstall called A Human Document. I can't remember the name of the author,
I don't
Baylock or whatever. And he wrote through it and created his own thing with comments. And I remember thinking that was so original and it was wonderful. And I used to teach that and thought it was a great work. And now there's an article I just read, now he died recently, saying, well, is it really so remarkable? And what do we think? Things date in which. I just wanted to ask you all what you thought of a humament.
Oh.
Well, I must say,
You don't know?
but the thing is, I've seen it. I mean, it makes an enormous exhibition, doesn't it? Because
Yes.
of page after page. I mean, and it's got, throughout his career, he's been embellishing it, and he was in some ways parallel to the London concrete poetry scene at that stage. But I would agree, it's a totally different thing, and in the end, I think fundamentally not that interesting.
No, and
that
I
you
mean,
made me
my reaction
What
would
did you
be
think, Nancy?
much more visual than it is really literary, and definitely not sonic. And I do think Jandl, certainly it's true that mostly Jandl worked as a sound poet, and in the exhibition you can hear him reading his trench poem, which is quite extraordinary and has no vowels. But the 2 poems tonight did have a visual component that, he did collaborate. And that's a topic we didn't even get to, but it's a very fascinating one, the importance of collaboration. For Finlay always worked with designers, artisans, craftsmen. Augusto sometimes did it himself, but often worked with artists. So Jandl, in the cases that Paul read, did. But let's open it up to the floor and to questions from anyone who's interested. Yes, Martin.
Thanks a lot for discussion. I have 3 points. To the political aspect first, I think John Cage was fascinated from the concrete poetry, especially by Hugo Ball and Kurt Schwitters. And he mentioned this is a kind of demilitarization of the language which is normally ordered by principles of subordination, because in concrete poetry you don't have any kind of subordination. The second point is the conflict between visualization and hearing. When Ernst Jandl would be here, still alive, he would refuse to show his poems on the wall.
Who? I'm sorry.
Ernst Jandl.
Who?
Jandl. Oh, Ernst
because
Jandl.
he mentioned the direct contact between concrete poetry is the contact between the recitator, the voice, and the listener, without any paper in between. And he mentioned too in Das Röcheln der Mona Lisa, I don't know the word in, he mentioned this aspect of people with inhibited voices, which is full of illness of the larynx. He mentioned the concrete poetry has to give a voice for people without voice. They have lost the voice. It means it's absolutely different. This aspect of visuality and humor and not humor. And the last one is, I think, very important. The musical consequences from the phonetic aspect of concrete poetry in composition, like in Anna Schwitter's Blume, an Anna Blume by Stefan Wolpe, or for György Ligeti was Kurt Schwitter's Sonat, the model for his Aventures, Nouvelles Aventures. It means there are really near consequences to go further from the sonorities, from the rhythmization, vocals in concrete poetry into the composition.
Is there a question particularly, or just
contribution.
Cage,
trying
by
to
the way,
bring
we didn't mention Cage.
Yeah.
Cage was the great favorite
Yeah.
of the Brazilians, and Augusto did a wonderful piece called
Yeah.
Cage, Chance, Change.
Yeah.
Cage, Chance, Change. A whole little book. And of course, they considered Cage like one of their, like Malamet.
But I didn't know Cage so favorably
Yeah.
looked at. That's very interesting.
But I hope I understood what you said, because your voice was very low. But you said something about the demilitarization of language. And I think that's a very, very good point, which I think begins already with Gertrude Stein. The language is kind of this open field, and it's not very regulated. So I wrote this essay a few years ago for a book that Marjorie did. And in my essay, I was talking about concrete poetry in the same context of, in Brazil, of the appearance of Bossa Nova, which was a modality of singing that relaxed the voice of the singer. So you have a very clear cut in Brazil from up to, the beginning of the 50s. The singer is the singer that can, project and kind of comes from operatic training. And then in Bossa Nova, it's all very quiet, and this, in a sense, I think relates to your question about the sound, which is such a big, I didn't want to get into that because it's a very big kind of a big issue, but they're very keen on very little sounds. So Lixo Luxo is just about these two sounds.
Yeah.
So
And look at the way it
Viva
ends.
Vaia, it's like this very almost imperceptible sounds.
Yeah.
And they do have a consequence, absolutely. Yeah.
I just saying, returning to Jandl, I mean, what I find extraordinary is his versatility and the way, for example, the wonderful way in which he transposes a Wordsworth poem into a kind of German. My heart Liebzapfen, I behold, and so on. And also, there's one point where he has sort of triangular poems, doesn't he? They start lustig, lustig, tig, lustig, tig, tig. You don't need a script to read them those. And there's a sense in which that's a kind of ideogram, really, isn't it? Which is perfect as a form as well as being a sound.
Yeah, and difference, the idea of difference, the smallest difference, comes back to your question. And repetition, we haven't really talked about repetition, but when you heard the poems read, there we get back to Gertrude Stein. Anything, if you repeat it enough, it becomes different, more different. It's never the same twice. So.
Yeah. It's kind of a paradox, both reducing language and
Here's a
repeating.
question.
Question. Eva.
I think mail art came a little bit later, right?
And mail art, the
Yes.
language isn't so.
Yeah.
It's the great mail art, yeah.
There was a very, I did an exhibition at the Bronx Museum with this Brazilian artist who's a visual artist and also poet, and he came after the concrete because there was this really crazy movement in Brazil called process poem that was very short-lived. Actually, the poets, they got together at a point and said, we are going to close the movement now. So it was a very finite kind of thing. And this guy, he came out of this, and he was involved in the mail art movement. But I think that was sort of mid-70s and on. It was not in the 60s. But I think your question is really interesting because I think some of the works in Mary Ellen Salt's anthology, I would put more in the context of mail art than, and I think, you know, some of the selection kind of helped to kind of confuse the terrain. I mean,
Well, to come back to your
That's
question on Apollinaire, it's interesting that you mentioned that because Augusto once said very angrily, Apollinaire wasn't very good. Mallarmé had already done everything for Apollinaire. But and I love Apollinaire. But Apollinaire, the big difference is voice. We haven't talked about that much. Apollinaire is a lyric poet, basically. And even though he does a lot with language and the visual, if you will, there's some of these same things, it's basically a lyric poem where you have a self, a very definite self, moving around the city like in Zone or in any of the Les Fenêtres, the kinds of descriptions. So one of the things that happens in concrete poetry is you reduce the element of self a great deal. I mean, these artists aren't talking, of course you can always detect a self, but there is no talk about there's really, you could go through, there's very little of that. And of course, the syntax is also much cut off. In other words, if you take an Apollinaire poem and you cut the syntax even further, so if you took Les Fenêtres, you would just have, let's say, fenêtre, and then you would do something with that one word, then you would have a concrete poem. So that's the difference. In mail art, I can't think of the name, I wrote a review of him. Who is the famous mail artist?
Ray Johnson.
Ray Johnson. In say somebody like Ray Johnson, in mail art, quite aside from coming later, I mean, language isn't really as important. It's more conceptual. It's the
more collage.
idea. And it's the idea of sending somebody something and sending it to all these people. So it's closer to conceptualism, I would say.
Well,
Don't
and
you
with
think?
Ray Johnson, a lot of the
couldn't think of the name of
beauty
the
of it is
person when he
these
wrote about
these postcards, whether sometimes it's collage, sometimes it's really just Xerox and sent, is the idea of, you know, kind of transformation. And when you receive the mail art, you might do something to it and send it on. And I don't think that has anything to do with the
Not
concrete
much.
poetry
No.
I mean,
aesthetic.
just coming back to the question of Apollinaire too, I mean, when I met Henri Chopin in the early 60s in Paris, he introduced me to Pierre Albert Biraud. And Pierre Albert Biraud had actually published several of the calligrams in Sikh. And I think personally that Henri Chopin is very much in that tradition, really. But it's completely different in the case of Finlay. In fact, I spent years in the 60s explaining to people why it was different. And it's partly because, again, if you take a poem like Il pleut, that is what Finlay would call mimetic. It tries to mime through type.
What rain looks like.
And it's, in its time, it's out of its time also, it's very interesting. But it's quite different from when Finlay has this poem which goes pleur, 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 solid column, universe type, and then a little cross and parapluie. And those two together, I think they show the essential difference in the two traditions.
That's interesting. Yes, Anne. Or other people back there.
I wanted to return to what you had to say about Pear and paper, Pear, paper. You explained in a very elegant way how Pear can refer to this various different interpretations, but now I'm wondering, what came first, the paper or the pear? What came first? and contemplating this, I want to share with you, my thought is that if you take the P, the middle P out of paper, you get pear. So I believe it's a play on sound. Also, you switch the two interior letters, A, E, E, A, and They're very, yes, they're
That's
very,
right.
Very good.
similar.
Yeah, that's great.
That's great.
Well, I mean,
Well done.
you have to recognize, I think, that this is one of a booklet. In other words, it's a single page in a sequence, and I think that does matter. I mean, you can look at it on its own, but it's important that because it begins, as it were, with the supposition that you've read Gomringer's Ping Pong. That's one thing. Actually, it ends. This was a kind of almost a sort of private joke between me and him, because I was very interested at that stage in a French poet called Francis Ponge,
Yeah.
and a French novelist called Robert Pinget. So it ends with Pinget, Ponge, Ponge, Pinget. And Ian said, if Ponge hadn't existed, there would be no Pinget. So in other words, it incorporates play, but the really major aspect of it, I think, is the motif of the pear, which for him is a kind of almost a sort of, it's as close he gets to a sort of erotic image. It's something which is in its fullness, a kind of perfect fruit, and a fruit which comes ready-made from the still lifes of Cubism, the still lifes of wild Greece, which he so loved.
But then he introduces apples.
Paper or pear? Which one, or
I'm
did
sorry, I
they-
didn't catch that.
whether he started with the idea about pear and then added paper, or did they both occur to him at once, or?
No, I think you could say that it's rather like somebody doing an improvisation on a theme. He starts with the idea of ping pong, the two closely associated
Paper pear.
phonemes, and he's publishing on paper, and it goes from
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. All right, thank you very much. Thank you.
Good questions. Yes, right here.
This is a little too concrete of a question, maybe, but how come the title is Pear? And then there are only 5 words.
There are 6 sheets of paper. So as it were, 6 individual poems in the book. You couldn't know that, but.
But what are the other pages say on them?
Well, one of them is I say, Pinget Ponge, Ponge, Pinget Ponge. In
That's
other
right.
words, it's a similar form, the repeated words and the triplet in the middle, a homage to Gomringer.
Yeah.
Gomringer, the
Gomringer.
first poet we talked about. Ernst
The poet who
Gomringer,
wrote about the
Swiss.
constellations.
Yeah.
Could we look at Happy Apple for just a second on this theme?
Yes,
And
another
I don't
fruit.
want to interrupt another question, but this is
Yes,
just,
okay.
this one is actually what? Homage to Wangri? I can't see it there. Yeah, to the painter Wangri, but here we have an apple, not a pear. And I think some really, another example to me of Finlay taking words that really don't have a semantic relationship to one another, as did the Italian futurists. Unrelated words, so you have happy and you have apple, but of course they have the double P. And so he's arranged it in such a way that you see that. And then there's this I in the middle, and you wonder what that has to do with it, because you've been reading in a circle, and of course the rectangle suggesting a table, but it's not mimetic, really, or iconic. And that I, which then we then read vertically, pip. And so we have happy apple, pip, pip, like the core of the apple, but just a suggestion. So quite a marvelous example, I think.
There's a question.
Yeah, I don't know where, right here, and then there.
Thank you very much. I have enjoyed the exhibit and your talk. And my question goes back to what you were explaining about internationalism and collaboration. It also goes to influences as well. I was wondering what relationship there was between the concrete poets in countries such as Brazil and Switzerland and Scotland and the lettrists in France. Were the lettrists an influence, and did they ever collaborate?
The lettriste.
The lettrists.
The lettress?
That's an interesting question.
Question.
And actually, again, in Henri Chopin's gallery in the Rue de l'Échaudé, I met Isidore Isou. And Isidore Isou was a very paranoid person, as you probably know. And I can remember him saying, "You must buy my books, because in a few years' time they'll be as dear to buy as the works of the Surrealists are now." And he was quite right, but I didn't buy them. but lettrisme had its own kind of strange little caucus, didn't it? And really, there
was a
was
kind of minor
contact,
movement.
but I don't think in my view, the best French concrete poet was a chap called Pierre Garnier, who lived in Amiens, and who was a German expert. And in a sense, I think that's partly why he had a slightly different framework from the Parisian-based ones.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think the Lettrets were kind of, I met some of them too, a kind of minor, actually, spin-off a little bit of concrete poetry. I mean, it's a fairly, it was interesting, but a fairly minor thing, working with letters. And it really was like almost like a footnote, I think, in that sense, to concrete poetry.
A question right there.
You were mentioning about you were talking about the about. What if the about became boring, to quote you, after the World War II era? Because I would argue that there's a lot of other mediums from the same era that were also less about the about in the same direct way that, say, Surrealism was. So what about the about in the post-World War II era became boring, as you said?
I can't
Yeah, I'm not
understand.
sure. What you said in the post-World War II, what happened when the about became boring?
What about the post-war era made the about boring?
Oh, I see. Why are they reacting to this
Right.
idea of the
'Cause
didactic
Because I would
or the
argue
about?
that that's just a really interesting concept, because
I
considering
see.
all
Yeah,
all the other mediums going on at the same time, some of the
You
mediums
mean rather
also
than
did
being
that.
an overtly political art, like the period before?
Yes.
Well, that's a very good
well,
question.
there's
I
also
think
that, but
I
there's
think
also
the answer is that art always wants to come back to the aesthetic in a way, and then it gets away from it and it comes back. Once the kind of what shall I say, the lassitude, and actually Augusto has some wonderful pages on that. When you're living in a place like Brazil, where they weren't even getting information, and they had so little, and then suddenly in 48, 49, they got a copy of Finnegan's Wake, they got a copy of Pound's Cantos, which they were always crazy about, and they wanted to see what art can do, whereas for a long time, art had been a sort of substitute politics. So, this is a kind of dialectic. It goes back and forth, and it goes back again the other way. And of course, at the same time, there were a lot of things working very differently. You had in the same period, that is in the 50s and 60s, especially in the novel, a lot of things that were straightforward politically, and so on. So there's always more than one thing. Concrete poetry is one thing. I mean, there are a lot of other things going on. At the same time, Fluxus, which the dates are very similar. Fluxus is very political. Fluxus is a kind of political equivalent of that. So there are always more than, one thing going on. It also depends on the country, and it depends on, there are many factors, but there's never one thing. There was certainly never a moment where concrete poetry was the thing. It's just so.
So it's more so a reaction as opposed to.
I think it's a reaction of wanting to realize just how great modernism was. I mean, at least that's my view.
Yeah.
I mean, we have never superseded the modernism of the early 20th century. We never, I don't know when we will, but there's always the effort. By the way, I should say, the Brazilians, for instance, hated the term postmodernism. When I first went to Brazil, it's when I'd written my book, The Futurist Moment. And they liked the book, except the chapter I had on Robert Smithson toward the end, where I used the term postmodern a lot. And they were very angry about that term. And they said, Marjorie, postmodernism is banks, ugly banks, money. That's postmodernism. We're not interested in that. We're modernists.
Yeah, we're
and by
modernists.
being modernists, they meant we care about art. And so they really didn't like, and they constantly said that to me, that was my one mistake, that I thought there was such a thing as postmodernism. Yes. And they said, just forget about that. So I'm not saying that's necessarily right, but the point is the term certainly has gone out of use again, postmodernism.
True.
And the thing is that the art of the first, there's a wonderful essay by Guy Davenport, one of the great, by the way, who knew, Jonathan Williams, and Finley. So there's a big connection. Somebody like Guy Davenport, who said the great things happened in the early century, even before World War I.
Yeah.
Joyce, many of these experiments, the architectural experiments, the musical experiments, the ballet, the Sacre du Printemps, all happened before the war. And it was such an incredible period that we always sort of come back to some version of that period, and because it was so striking, and because that was the period that was revolutionary both aesthetically and politically, and we've never had it since. You see, I think the Russian, who I think is the greatest avant-garde, they were very political too, and aesthetic, and they meshed. And then later on, the two avant-gardes go apart a lot. That is, the aesthetic and the political don't necessarily go together. the idea of aesthetic revolution and political revolution. And the reason we hark back to the early centuries so much is there you had a kind of conjunction.
Yeah. I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Marie is up there.
Oh, Marie, where? I'm not seeing her. Yeah, and then we'll.
She's had her hand up for ages.
Who has?
This woman in blue.
Oh, okay. I don't know that I saw. You're right. Or who had their hand up?
The lady in the light blue.
Oh, let her go then. Okay, we'll do. I'm sorry. And then we can.
We can talk in the lobby.
Yes, and then we
she's
can
had
go
her
out in the
hand
lobby.
Mine's real quick,
I
and
didn't
it
see
goes
that.
along with this idea of collaboration and exchange of ideas internationally. And I was wondering what you felt the role, if any, the Edinburgh Festival might have played in that exchange when its origins were near Finley's home and invited artists from around the world to come and exchange ideas. And did that have an effect on the exchange of the ideas in the concrete poetry world and the spread of those ideas?
I don't know what to say about that.
So,
The Edinburgh Festival and its effect on Finley, or
I mean, I think the Edinburgh Festival certainly brought people to visit his garden when he got there. I mean, and indeed, I suppose, yes, I mean, Edinburgh was, as you say, a real international place. And I mean, that leads me to also make just a sort of small footnote to that, because we were talking about, again, postmodernism and so on, which only kind of gets going towards the end of the 60s. But there was a remarkable event in London in 1965, which was a poetry festival in the Royal Albert Hall. And it was a festival which was, in one way, a debacle, because a Scottish novelist called Alexander Trochy, who had injected himself with the goodness knows what beforehand, kind of sort of spaced out on the stage. But the real success of that was Ernst Jandl.
really?
Ernst Jandl did a reading,
65.
yes, and he was visiting England. He visited Finley afterwards, and I think got a lot out of it, that particular visit.
Okay. We have you. No? Marie? Yes. You have her.
Yeah, actually, this is probably a question that we'd have to discuss after, but it kind of relates to the
Can't
political
hear.
question. So
Speak
looking,
up just a little.
oh, is that better?
Better. much
Okay,
better.
great. So looking at this, the title poem of the panel here, it just kind of occurs to me that it's really just the letter P moving between variations of the word ear. But it's so obviously a visual poem. So, I think in concrete poetry it's always about opposites. It's always about the containment of opposites. This kind of like opposition of things, but very neutral things. But I think somehow it's related to the political question, because that's really something you can't do in political poetry or political writing. You can't contain opposition. You can't neutralize it, you can't contain it. So, I don't know, I feel like somehow just the nature of what concrete poetry is kind of antithetical in a way to being political. Yeah.
Interesting. Antithetical to the political because of.
Can't contain oppositions.
Well, it depends how
Because
you
it does
define the
contain
political,
it
I
does.
guess, yeah.
Well, when the Brazilian concrete poets, they republished their manifesto from the early 50s. In the 60s, they added a line from from Mayakovsky,
Oh. Yeah.
that says that there is no revolutionary art without a revolutionary form. And I think that's where, when true political art happen, when, you come up with a new form. And I think that's what, many of these young men are doing.
Could I say that it's partly the situation of the poet also, which is important there, because after the Russian tanks moved in 1967 to Prague, the Czech poet Jiří Ralok was still sending me concrete poems. And that, of course, was a gesture quite different from the poems that I knew from him previously. There was a kind of stance which that embodied, which I think was definitely political.
Interesting. Okay, I think, oh dear, I can't say no to you because you've had so you'll be our last formal question.
One of the questions I have that we haven't touched upon is the scale of the poetry, right?
The scale.
The scale. That
Very
it could
important.
be a broadside, that could be a page, it could be the side of building. And so we've talked about the space within the screen,
Right.
right? But could you talk a little bit about the scale?
Well, we try to address that in the exhibition. We have a section called Shifting Media, and it specifically addresses this fascination, and really this applies to Finlay and to Augusto. I have to be careful because some of the exhibition is more broadly applied and some is more focused on those two. But what happens with the poem Acrobats, for example, is you see it as a screen print. You see it in a letter where he's writing to Emmett Williams and showing, and then it becomes a large piece on a wall of his house with the letters made out of cork. And so there's this fascination and transformation, and the Augusto does similar things with these signature poems like Viva Vaia, Lujo Lijo, Rever, Lingua Viagem is another one, where when we were in Brazil, in São Paulo, we saw this. He actually recreated Lingua Viagem as a huge metal sculpture that was it metal? Am I saying the right thing? Was that Viva Vaia? I'm not sure. I'd have to go back in my pictures. But anyway, the scale changes dramatically.
Do you think the scale is also another feature that encourages multiple representations of the text, or multiple representations?
Yes, absolutely.
To be rendered in different forms and different
Absolutely. And there's
That's a different feature than a text.
right. That's right. Yeah, I think the transfer, and it's a transformation in scale, but also in material. In some cases, say Viva Vaia is generally red, and that's a way of recognizing it, but Lingua Viagem seems to take on different colors. In the exhibition Caja Preta, the black box, you see sculptural forms of some of the poems. So it can be scale, it can be color, material, but there's always, as Marjorie always mentions, this pleasure of recognition. The idea that you
For what?
intoxicating for that it's intoxicating for the digital age, meaning it's challenging the digital age.
When you can do. But could I say one more word about the political, just to come back to Marie's question a minute? I think that we haven't talked about the Austrian school really at all. Achleitner, these people. I have a big fat book at home. The Austrian school right after the war. Now those are the ones that are almost the most purist, that just have one word carried through and so on. And the idea was that the things that have happened are so horrible that we can only respond by. It's what you said before, Martin, silence almost in a way, or near silence, so that it is very spare, and it is the opposite of having pictures of tanks or pictures of, so, there are many reactions to the political. That was a political reaction in a country that had, it's the time of the third man, okay? And so instead of the usual thing where all you ever saw was submarines or tanks or so on, you'll have a single word and it'll be very, very spare. But that was a political reaction, and that's one way of looking at that. And that takes us back to scale in a way, because the scale is peculiar. I mean, it is a scale that is anti-representational. That's one of the main things, that we're not going to have pictures here. And don't forget, those are all you saw throughout the war. Endless pictures of Spitfires and this and so forth. So you're getting something that is almost saying, don't talk about that. Look at it, another way, I think.
And just coming back to the idea of scale again, I think one of the interesting things about Acrobats, which Nancy referred to, is that right from the start, there's the aspiration of having it on a wall or in a children's playground, something like that. But of course, the aspiration isn't the same as the realization. Finlay was trying throughout the 60s to find the context in which he could actually, not in his own garden, but in a public context in which he could put up these works. And one of the first occasions which we could do that was when a show I organized at the Brighton Festival in 1967, where, for example, we put Gomringer's Wind on a banner floating on the trees opposite the Brighton Pavilion.
How great.
And this was, of course, for Gomringer, it's the first time that this had happened. effectively. And I think it did show that the banner, the printed banner, for which we're enormously indebted to a great typographer called Edward Wright, because, you know, again, it couldn't be done simply, but the effort was worth it.
It's interesting.
I think we are going to close now. Thank you so much for coming.
The time went
And
very
we'll be
fast,
outside. Please, that's good.